Hey folks, and welcome back to the video lectures for Philosophy 120 Critical Thinking, Unit 3. So what we're doing today is we're digging into the R condition of those ARG conditions for cogent and good arguments that we're looking at. This class is all about critical thinking. It's all about how to become better, critical, deep, and evaluative thinkers in just about every area of the stuff that we do. So what we're looking at today is the second of the three conditions for good cogent arguments. And we'll review those in just 1 second in case you've forgotten on some of them. I don't know how you guys are spacing out some of the videos or how long you guys are taking in between lectures. So we'll recap for your benefit. And then we'll spend the rest of the lecture basically looking at a number of different mistakes that people often make when it comes to judging the relevance of premises, because there is no hard and fast rule for how these things link up. Instead, there are simply dangers and common mistakes that we can learn to look out for. We'll also talk a little bit about the burden of proof and how emotional appeals to guilt and anger and pity and a number of other things can often mask the irrelevance of a claim. But first, that recap that I promised. So remember from our first couple of lectures, we're talking about dealing with arguments. We're looking at sets of claims and ideas given in support of some other claim, the basic unit of how we try and convince people to various ideas and concepts, the basic unit of how we do a lot of our thinking. And we're concerned mainly with good arguments, what we're calling cogent arguments, arguments that are structured in such a way, can't talk today, in such a way to give us good reason to accept their conclusions. And our textbook gives us three conditions to look out for. A cogent argument has to have acceptable premises. Those premises have to be relevant to the conclusion. And those premises on their own and taken as a whole unit have to give us good and sufficient grounds for believing that conclusion. Now, so far, we've talked a little bit about the acceptability of premises. We looked at some situations where we can automatically judge a premise to be acceptable, like when it's a matter of common knowledge or when it's a priori true. We also looked at some grounds for rejecting a premise as acceptable. Times when claims are the sort of things we really just shouldn't accept or treat as plausible and viable reasons for a conclusion. Today we're looking at that second condition, though, the R condition, the condition of having relevant premises. Because it's not just enough that you say plausible things when you're trying to support your conclusion. Those things need to relate in a certain way to your conclusion. That is, they need to count in favor or against the thing that you're trying to talk about, either in favor of or against. So we're going to spend some time digging into that situation and some of the mistakes and pitfalls, as I said, that people often make when judging this sort of stuff. Now, there's three basic sorts of relevance that we need to consider. What we can call positive relevance, negative relevance, and irrelevance. And none of these, I think, are particularly complicated. We just need to make sure that we get the terminology straight. A statement is positively relevant to another one whenever that first statement, let's call it A, counts in favor of the second statement being true. So we can say that A is positively relevant to B if A actually counts in favor of B being true. Not just like vaguely being connected in it, but if A is true, we've got good reason to say that B is also true, which seems a bit direct and simple, but it's honestly something worth keeping in mind. Because it's worth keeping in mind that, for one, we're talking about truth when we're dealing with these things. And two, we're dealing with if one of these is true, the other one is also likely true. Now, negative relevance is the same sort of relationship, but with the opposite polarity. We're dealing with falsity with negative relevance. So we might say that A is negatively relevant to B when the truth of A counts in favor of B being false. So it still counts in favor of something, but it counts in the opposite direction. Maybe a better way of talking about it might be that A undermines B instead of giving it support. A counts against B rather than counting in favor of its falsehood or something like that. Now, irrelevance is sort of the neutral third option between the two. A statement is irrelevant to another one when it neither counts for or against statement B. So, for example, out of all of these, we can use a couple of basic examples to illustrate them. I've got one here up on the screen for positive relevance, saying that the fact that homework is a major part of your grade, the fact that that statement's true does count in favor of the idea that you should do your homework to get a good grade being true. If the first one's true, that counts in favor in some way of the second one being true. We could do the same sort of thing with negative relevance. If I said that you've not done any of your homework in here, and then I had the second statement, you have a good grade in the class, the first statement does not count in favor for the second one. If you've not done any of the homework in here, well, then that fact does not count in favor of you having a good grade. In fact, it counts against it. It counts in favor of the second statement being false. But I could also say something like, it's sunny outside today, and that has no bearing whatsoever on what your grade's actually like. So we might say that it's sunny outside is irrelevant to the quality of your grade or whatever else. Now, like I said, none of these three are complicated so far, but keeping these three in mind as we go through some of the other fallacies and mistakes that we'll deal with should help keep things a little bit more clear as to why some of these things are mistakes. Now, when we're dealing with relevance as an actual condition for cogent arguments, relevance is probably one of the things that matters most out of all of these. If the premises don't actually count in favor of the conclusion, then we obviously can't have a cogent argument, because a cogent argument, by definition, is one whose premises give support for the conclusion. Relevance is where the link is made between what's said in the premises and what's said in the conclusion. If we don't have this condition, we don't have a good argument at all. In fact, it's arguable in the ordinary sense whether or not you even have an argument or whether you just have a loose collection of statements. Now, furthermore, it's also worth noting that when dealing with and when judging an argument on the R condition, we're looking at the premises as a whole to determine cogency. So it's not just individual premises that we can judge to be relevant or not. We can also judge the entire set of premises as a collection as being relevant or not. And so those are two different ways that we can apply and judge this whole thing. It's also worth noting that there are some arguments that can be reconstructed to make them into better arguments. Earlier on in the semester, we talked about standardizing an argument, and we talked about adding hidden or unstated premises and conclusions when we're writing the thing out in standard form or a line-by-line form. We can take this a step further and actually reconstruct the argument by adding premises that are totally absent in the original argument. And by doing so, we can often make the reasons as a whole lot more relevant. Like, take earlier my example of an irrelevant statement, saying that it's sunny outside right now, as being irrelevant to your actual grade. Now, I could reconstruct that argument, and I could add several statements about why that actually does affect your grade in some way. Maybe I start saying something like, well, it's sunny outside, and when it's sunny outside, your teacher's in a much better mood. And when he's in a much better mood, he grades far more easily. And it's been sunny a lot. Therefore, it's sunny outside does actually count in favor a little bit of you getting a good grade in here. Doing that is a reconstructed argument. But I think that example also illustrates some of the dangers of reconstructing arguments. Even though I've added more premises, the original argument of it's sunny outside, therefore you have a good grade in here, that's obviously not nearly the kind of thing that I said in the reconstructed version. The reconstructed argument says something entirely different. Really, it ought to be treated as a separate argument because it states something very different from the original. Furthermore, just because I added more premises to get relevance didn't actually make the thing any more cogent, because probably at least a couple of those premises should be treated as unacceptable. The idea that uh, the sunnier it is, the better my mood is, that one might be true, but it's difficult to establish that it's actually true. We might only have to provisionally accept that because you may not know me well enough to know how the sunlight affects me. You may not have heard any testimony on the matter. May not be any psychologist or biologist available to talk about how those sorts of things generally affect people. It's not a priori true. It's not a matter of common knowledge that it's necessarily true, even though it is probably widely believed. So there's all sorts of other issues that could come up to criticize the acceptability of it. And that's not even getting to the G conditions that we'll talk about spread over a couple of chapters. So reconstructing an argument doesn't necessarily make it any better in terms of overall cogency, but we can do so sometimes to follow along with the principle of charity and try and give a arguer or a position the best chance that we can. Now, another thing just in general about this whole relevancy thing. An argument that has irrelevant premises is sometimes called a non sequitur. That is literally something that does not follow. The phrase in Latin literally means it does not follow. So when you call something a non sequitur, you're talking about something that doesn't follow from the previous reasons being given. This is follow in the same sense of I can't follow what you're saying, or I don't really see what you mean here, or something like that. We don't literally mean the physical act of following. I only bring that up because I know that we don't use that phrase nearly as much anymore in ordinary English. But in some texts or in some examples, if you go looking around for additional ones, or if you do some additional practice in the textbook, you may see arguments being discussed as non sequiturs, or you may see it discussed that they have red herrings in the premises or in the argument. And a red herring is nothing more than an irrelevant or a distracting statement. Similarly, a non sequitur is just an argument that fails on the R condition. So these are a few just general things that we ought to know before we start digging into some individual mistakes that people make with relevancy. A further note for some of you who are probably getting a little bit excited that we're actually digging into fallacies in detail. Fallacies are a really popular thing to talk about, especially online or in debate circles and that sort of thing. And I know because I spend far too much time on the internet and I did debate in high school. But in those circles, it's both fun to talk about fallacies, and there's an unfortunate habit of simply naming or accusing something of being a fallacy and treating that as an actual argument or criticism of the position being given. When in actuality, that's just a terribly lazy thing to do. And I hate to put it that bluntly, but it's simply what's true. Naming a fallacy on its own is not an argument against something. If something is committing a certain kind of mistake, the certain sort of common mistake that a fallacy is, really you ought to actually explain what the mistake is and where they're making it and why this makes the argument not something that should be believed, why it's not cogent. Simply naming an argument or saying, oh, that's an ad hominem, or oh, that's a straw man. You committed a fallacy there. That on its own is not a polite or a very well I cannot talk today. Supported criticism of another position. So don't be that guy. Don't just name and throw out fallacies and consider that the end of your arguing. It's just intellectually lazy and it's not polite, just in general. So, with that said, let's start digging into a few of these fallacies of relevance. And remember, a fallacy is just a common mistake in reasoning. It's something that a lot of people do, and it's not just something that a lot of people do, but something that occasionally makes an argument look cogent when it actually isn't. It's a mistake that appears to be perfectly legitimate reasoning in a lot of ways. And so it's worth learning the names of these sorts of things, learning to recognize these so that we can catch ourselves before we sort of wander into a pit hole or a pitfall in the middle of the road as we go through all these things. Now, the first one of these I want to talk about is what's called the straw man fallacy. And this is probably one of the most common fallacies of relevance that people commit. The straw man fallacy is named because essentially what somebody's doing is misrepresenting somebody else's view. They're setting up a metaphorical straw man, like a scarecrow, that they can then easily knock down and criticize. So when someone misrepresents a view and says that this is what the view is, it's X, Y, and Z, when none of that's actually the case, and then they criticize that view for believing X, Y, and Z, well, they're not really attacking the view that they think they are. They're committing a fallacy of relevance because they're talking about something, or they think they're talking about something, but really they're not. They're talking about something else entirely. And this is the sort of thing that you see with a lot of political debates and that sort of thing. Like, for example, it's not uncommon to describe the left wing of American politics as being socialist or communist in certain ways, particularly in right wing media in a lot of places. And that sort of thing, people will end up saying something like, "Oh, all you're just trying to argue for some kind of communism in this country," and that obviously doesn't work because look at all the people that have starved and how the system's failed and a number of other things. But full out communism is, I think, virtually never something that's actually argued for by most left wing politicians. There may be a few fringe folks that do that sort of thing, but it's highly, highly uncommon. So, describing the American left, the Democrats or progressives or whoever, as being communists or automatic socialists or something like that simply isn't an accurate representation of the view. And if you describe the position as communism, and then you start talking about all the faults of communism and why that doesn't work, and therefore that's why you shouldn't vote Democrat, well, that's a fallacy of relevance because you're not really giving good reasons or any reasons at all that have to do with voting Democrat. You're talking about reasons to not be a communist. And those are two entirely different things. Similarly, it happens in the other direction. Uh, People who accuse all conservatives of being Bible thumping, gun toting rednecks, and then talk about why this group of people or why that set of views is entirely unjustified, largely isn't actually talking about American conservatism, at least at its core anyway. So again, it's setting up a straw man, setting up an intentionally weak position just so you can knock it down and criticize it. When in reality, you're not really criticizing anything real at all. So this is something in particular to watch out for. Easiest way to avoid it, accurately describe your opponent's position. In fact, try and describe that position so well that you want them to wish that they'd phrased it that way. That's honestly kind of the ideal in polite, rational debate. For one, it's the nice and, you know, kind and charitable thing to do. And two, if you can shut down the best version of their view, that especially shows that your position's correct. So purely as even a matter of like debate strategy, far better to avoid this than it is to commit it. Another similar sort of thing to worry about or to recognize is what's called the ad hominem fallacy. And this is when you criticize the person rather than the view in question. We have another nice Latin phrase here that literally means arguing ad hominem, to the person or towards the man. And an ad hominem is committed whenever we talk about the qualities of the person who holds the view rather than the view itself. And sometimes these criticisms are entirely valid. Like, say, if I'm trying to reject Adolf Hitler's beliefs about eugenics, talking about how Adolf Hitler is a terrible person in a lot of ways is entirely legitimate. But, big but here, the fact that he's a terrible person doesn't mean his views are automatically wrong. The fact that someone is terrible or has whatever qualities you want to accuse them of, that's not a reason why the things that they say are false. If Hitler were to tell you that the sky is blue, the fact that he's Hitler, that he's literally Hitler, doesn't mean that the sky is purple or something out there today, or that he's wrong about the sky being blue. Who he is and what he says, or who anybody is and what anybody says, are in two entirely different things. So If we're going to criticize positions, we need to actually criticize positions. Focusing on the person instead or being insulting in some way simply doesn't speak to the views at all. It's not giving any sort of relevant criticism to the position that we're looking at. Now, literally talking about Hitler is something that usually only happens in exaggerated examples, simply because it's an easy one to do. But this sort of thing does show up an awful lot, especially in political discussions, but even in ordinary ones. You've probably heard some variation of, "Oh, you're just too young to understand this sort of thing yet," or "Oh, you're a literal baby killer. Why should I listen to your political opinions?" Or "Why should I take your health advice? You're fat," or something like that. And so these are all criticisms of the person that don't necessarily speak at all to the relevance or the acceptability of the positions being talked about. A variation of this that especially comes up with things like the, "Oh, well, your health advice is probably terrible. Look how fat you are," is sometimes called the tu quoque, the "you too" kind of criticisms. Like, "Oh, well, if this thing, you say this thing's terrible, but you do the same thing. You do this too." Well, that's really not an actual criticism of the view. It's a variation of the ad hominem, and it's a mistake to treat that as a relevant reason for not accepting the position. Another similar position is what's called the fallacy of guilt by association. And this is essentially ad hominem but targeted towards groups instead. This is where we get closer to the all liberals or communists kind of deal. Rather than, say, rejecting a democratic policy about something, somebody might say, "Oh, well, all the Democrats are basically communists, and communists are all terrible, so I'm not going to listen to anything that you have to say." By associating a person with some undesirable group, well, then you insinuate that that's a reason to reject the position. But again, this is entirely missing the actual position and argument being made. So when somebody criticizes something that someone's associated with, rather than the position itself, again, we're making a kind of mistake of relevance, a fallacy of relevance. Two more that often show up are what's called appeals to ignorance and appeals to popularity. Both of these are less obvious than some of the issues we've talked about before, but they're still mistakes of relevance when judging arguments. These are uh, traps that we often fall into when judging or criticizing some position, or when supporting some position, I guess is more accurate. Uh, a mistaken appeal to ignorance is whenever we start talking about how we don't know something, we don't have evidence for a particular claim, and therefore that claim is false. This is something that occasionally is well justified, but most of the time is actually a mistake. So, an example of this sort of thing would be saying something like, "Well, what would be a good one? Science is usually a good sort of set of examples for this sort of thing. Suppose that a pharmaceutical company releases a new treatment for cancer tomorrow. And so the company starts arguing, well, the new miracle drug, Wanda Cure, is perfectly safe because we have no evidence of any harms that it causes. And on its own, that sounds fantastic. If there's no evidence of harms, if we don't know that it causes any harms, well, that sounds at first like good evidence for saying, therefore, it's harmless. It doesn't cause any harms. But on its own, that actually doesn't say anything about it. The fact that we don't know anything about harms, that we don't have any evidence of harms yet, isn't on its own a reason to actually say that there are no harms. All it says is that we don't know of any yet. Maybe the harms are long term. Maybe they're things that take 15 years to show up. Maybe it causes birth defects. Maybe the situation in which it causes some sort of harm to the patient just hasn't shown up yet. Now, in some situations, the absence of evidence is actual evidence. If we were to, investigate a dorm room or something like that, and say we're looking all over the dorm room, and we say, well, there's no evidence that a murder here happened here, so we're going to go ahead and say that no, the victim Johnny Smith was not killed here. In that type of situation where you're reasoning by induction, something we'll talk about later on in the semester, in that kind of situation, the lack of evidence does seem to be an actual relevant claim that supports the conclusion. However, in most cases, the mere fact that we lack knowledge about something is on its own not relevant to whether or not a claim is true. Just think of it in the simple way, fact, or the simple way of the fact that we don't know something doesn't mean it's automatically false. There's all sorts of things that you and I both don't know. I know hardly anything about the details of neurobiology aside from freshman level anatomy and physiology and that sort of thing. That doesn't mean that any claim that you tell me about neurobiology is automatically false just because I don't know it. That would be crazy if that were the case. My not knowing has nothing to do with whether or not it's true or false. The same sort of thing goes on with appeals to popularity. And this is, again, why we call this a fallacy of relevance, because it just has nothing to do with what's going on. An appeal to popularity, especially a fallacious appeal to popularity, happens whenever somebody tries to cite how widely believed something is as evidence that it's true. Like, say, for example, let's presume that what would be a decently controversial but mild and inoffensive topic? The usual sorts of things that you look for when you come up with these sorts of examples. Let's take the idea that aliens exist. Let's suppose that in 2019, thanks to a brand new Netflix show about all this sort of stuff, the entire country starts to believe that aliens do in fact exist. Now, if I were to cite that fact in an argument as a premise in favor of the statement, therefore aliens exist, I would be committing a mistake. The fact that 90% of Americans believe that aliens exist or something like that is entirely irrelevant to whether or not they do exist. It's just simply not a relevant fact. It doesn't count in favor or against aliens existing at all. And so my appeal to it, my citing it as a reason, my use of it as a premise, is actually a mistake of relevance. I'm mistaking an irrelevant claim for a relevant one. Now, this is a little bit different from common knowledge that we talked about with the acceptability of premises. When we talked about a premise being acceptable on the basis of it being common knowledge, we're talking about things that don't need further evidence for their being true, because everyone knows them. However, in the case of common knowledge, the reason that it's true is not the fact that everybody knows it. It's the fact that we've all seen the evidence for it. It's that we all have experience of it or something like that. We were all taught it by reliable testimony from our teachers or our parents or something. The fact that it's widely believed, that fact, has nothing to do with the fact that it's actually true. So here, the mistake with an appeal to popularity is citing the popularity as the reason it's true. That's the mistake committed in this fallacy and in most of the other fallacies of relevance. It's when we're looking at the wrong kind of thing as evidence in favor of it being true. We're looking at the wrong sort of thing for a positive relevance relationship. Common knowledge on its own, perfectly fine to cite, but don't cite the fact that it's common knowledge as the reason for whatever the thing is that we're talking about. Now, a couple of other things worth talking about that are not necessarily fallacies. For one, it's worth talking about something related to all of this called the burden of proof. Now, this is a general concept that you might see thrown around, especially in discussions of relevance and in discussions of fallacies. The burden of proof is merely the concept that we have an obligation to defend the claims that we make using argument and evidence. This isn't something to throw around and just cite as another criticism, the way I warned about just throwing the names of fallacies around as a reason against somebody's position. Instead, this is merely a simple concept that we ought to explain and defend ourselves. We ought to give reasons for the things that we claim are true. And this comes up, especially in debates about relevance, because we might have questions about where the burden of proof lies in some situations. That is, if somebody makes a claim and it's not clear why it's true, then we might wonder, does this person then have the burden of proof? Do they have an obligation to explain why this controversial claim is true? There's no hard and fast rules, at least none that we have good access to anyway, about when the burden of proof is on who in a conversation. But it's probably safe to assume that unless the claim that you're talking about is either common knowledge or an a priori truth, we can assume that you have some degree of an obligation to explain why it's true. It's just simply good manners and it's good rational practice. Now, a final thing that's worth talking about in these discussions of relevance is what we might call an appeal to emotion. Now, these are things that are fallacious. It's another mistake of relevance, but it's a little bit different from the ones we've done so far. Appeals to emotion make the same basic mistake that the other fallacies do. They look to the wrong kind of thing as evidence for the truth of a claim. But these take a somewhat different form than all of the others. You can imagine, say, well, let's take a common thing from American culture. Let's take the concept of the tooth fairy. Suppose that your parents say to you, you should believe in the tooth fairy, or else you're not going to get any money under your pillow for that tooth that you lost. This is an appeal to emotion. In a way, it's an appeal to either fear or the hope of a benefit by saying, you should believe this, or else you're going to miss out on this wonderful thing that is, finding money magically under your pillow, which as a kid is awesome. I mean, as an adult, it'd be awesome, but a quarter isn't going to do a whole lot. But regardless, the fact that you'll benefit from it doesn't actually give much in the way of evidence that the tooth fairy actually exists. It doesn't really say anything about the tooth fairy's existence. Because, for example, we all know for a fact that the tooth fairy doesn't exist. If you didn't know that, I'm terribly, terribly sorry, but I assume, given that we're all adults here. I hope someday somebody tells you about Santa Claus. But anyway, jokes aside, the fact that we all benefited, or that many of us benefited from the concept of the tooth fairy in American or Western culture, doesn't mean that the tooth fairy actually existed, because we all know full well that it was parents or a family friend or our guardians who gave us the money instead. But the original argument, believe in the tooth fairy or you're not going to get 25 cents under your pillow, that's a terrible argument. It's citing the wrong kind of thing as evidence for the existence of the tooth fairy. And we see this sort of thing happen a lot with a full range of emotions. If somebody were to hold a gun to your head and say, you should believe this or else I'm going to blow your brains out or something like that, that's a terrible reason to believe something. Now, there are very real consequences to not believing that. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't, say something and try and get out of there with your life and safety and dignity intact, or life and safety if nothing else. Always try and protect yourself. You deserve that. But if we're talking specifically about truth and rational argument and critical thinking, the gun to your head doesn't change the truth of the world. If I were to hold a gun to your head and say, believe in the tooth fairy or I'm going to shoot you, that may give you good reason to lie to me. That may give you good reason to act like the tooth fairy is real. But that doesn't actually give you good rational reason to believe in the tooth fairy. It doesn't make it more likely, it doesn't count in favor of it being true that the tooth fairy exists. Now, usually these sorts of things are not nearly so obvious as the kind of examples that I'm talking about. You see this sort of thing happen a whole lot more insidiously in advertising, in politics, those two areas in particular. You'll see subtle insinuations that if you don't agree with this policy, or if you don't vote this way, or if you don't do this particular thing, then things are going to turn out terribly, or you're going to miss out in some way. A lot of times the conclusions aren't even said, they're simply implied through the imagery or through the other things that are offered. Like, for example, you may see something like a beer commercial that seems to imply that if you buy this beer, then you're going to have this kind of fantastic life. You're going to be surrounded by friends. You're going to be partying. You're all going to be inexplicably laughing as you hold your label facing outward bottles. and you're all going to be doing things in bars that almost never happen because nobody's that excited to be there. And overall, it may not be explicitly stated. This may just be the picture that's sort of just given to you in pictures. You may see people holding the bottles and acting this way and making this implicit connection between them, but that's effectively the argument that's being presented. And it's a terrible argument. The fact that you bought Bud Light as opposed to Miller Lite isn't most likely going to change the quality of your overall life. That sort of thing just isn't relevant to how much fun you're going to have on a given evening, or how many friends you're going to have, or how attractive you'll be to the opposite sex, or whichever sex you're trying to attract, or whichever gender you're trying to attract, if anyone. These things are just simply irrelevant, but simply because they're looking to something that has no effect on what they're trying to convince you of. They're appealing to emotions on your end to try and influence things that emotions really don't have any place being involved in, just as a matter of causal fact. So these are other things that it's worth learning the name of this so that we can try and recognize it and avoid it, both in our own presentations and avoid being unduly influenced by it when we don't want to be, avoiding things that we don't have rational support in believing. So that about wraps it up for this unit. So what we're going to do looking ahead. The next unit has us start to apply these first two talks of conditions and cogent arguments to particular logical systems. We're going to start looking at arguments done using Aristotle's version of categorical logic, stuff like the Socrates example that we started the semester with, the all men are mortal kind of thing. So we're going to start looking at categorical logic in Unit 4. We're going to start looking at evaluating arguments in different systems and digging a little bit more into what it means to satisfy that G condition. And next unit is also when your midterm happens. I know it feels like probably a long way off or very not so far off, depending on when you're watching this lecture. But it's something to be mindful of as you plan your workload as we go into the next several weeks. Also, take a look at your homework if you haven't already. You guys should be able to work your way through all of the problems at this point. You should also take a look at the journal if you haven't done that yet. And don't forget to follow your unit checklist in general if you're unsure about which readings or which assignments you still need to do. In the meantime, though, good luck with your studies. Hope your semester's going great. Happy thinking, guys.